Welcome to the series Knight-Tok, to fall asleep fast. A place where you don't need to do anything at all except listen and let your thoughts slowly settle. Before you drift off, you can gently like this video and, if you wish, leave a quiet comment sharing where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Tonight, we gently explore what if medieval knights had social media. A quiet story from history told at a calm, unhurried pace, with no rush and nowhere you need to be. If you listened to the previous night, welcome back. And if this is your first night, you can begin right here, exactly as you are. A new night will be waiting for you again tomorrow. But for now, allow yourself to rest, breathe softly, and let this story slowly carry you into sleep. Long before names could travel faster than footsteps, the medieval world moved at the pace of daylight and rest. Villages woke with the sun and slept when darkness returned, not because clocks demanded it, but because the body understood no other rhythm. Stone houses held warmth during the day and released it slowly at night, and the narrow paths between them carried only familiar sounds. In such a world, influence did not spread outward. It settled inward. Reputation existed, but it was local, contained, and deeply personal. A man or a woman was known because they had been seen, because their actions had unfolded within the same small circle of lives over many seasons. A blacksmith's skill was recognized by the evenness of his iron. A farmer's reliability was measured by whether he appeared each spring ready to sow again. These judgments formed quietly, without ceremony, shaped by repetition rather than display. Knights, too, belonged to this rhythm. Before tournaments grew grand, and before banners traveled far, a knight was known first by proximity. Armor was worn for protection, not presentation. Horses were valued for endurance, not appearance. Even symbols, when they appeared, served practical recognition rather than ambition. A shield bore marks not meant to impress strangers, but to be recognized by allies on a crowded field. Stories traveled slowly, often carried unintentionally. A merchant passing through might mention a local lord in another town, not to spread fame, but to make sense of his own journey. A pilgrim might recall a noble act witnessed weeks before, softened by memory and distance. These stories were fragile. They changed with each retelling, losing sharp edges, gaining warmth, until they resembled dreams more than records. In this early medieval quiet, no one curated how they were seen beyond their immediate surroundings. There was no audience beyond the familiar. What mattered most was consistency, the steady alignment between action and expectation. To act bravely once was notable, but to act reliably over years was what anchored a reputation. Night in such places carried weight. When the sun disappeared, the world did not simply dim, it withdrew. Fires were lit not to create atmosphere, but to endure the cold. Inside halls and homes, people gathered not to be seen, but to share warmth and silence. Words were fewer. Listening mattered more than speaking. Memory was shaped in these moments, not by spectacle, but by presence. Knights returning from service would remove their armor slowly, methodically, each piece placed where it belonged. The sound of metal against wood was familiar, comforting. There was no sense of being watched beyond the walls of the hall. What happened here would remain here, absorbed by those who witnessed it directly. Yet even in this contained world, something subtle stirred. Humans, even then, carried an awareness of how they were perceived. A glance held a little longer. A gesture made slightly more deliberate. These were not performances, but instincts. Early signals of something that would one day expand far beyond village borders. The idea of being remembered lingered quietly beneath daily life. Not remembered widely, but remembered correctly. To be thought of kindly when absent. To have one's name spoken without hesitation. These were small desires, rarely acknowledged, yet deeply human. As paths between settlements slowly became more traveled, as markets drew strangers together, the possibility of a name outliving a single place began to take shape. At first, it was barely noticeable. A name recognized elsewhere caused mild surprise, nothing more. But the seed was there. In a hush before sleep, this early world feels distant yet familiar. A place where influence was not chased, only accumulated by accident. where identity formed slowly, like stone worn smooth by water, and where the idea that a reputation might travel, untethered from the person themselves, had not yet fully arrived. But the night does not stop moving, and somewhere beyond the village edge, a road continues into darkness, carrying with it the first quiet signs of change. As the road slowly stretched beyond the edges of familiar land, the medieval world began to change in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. Paths that had once served only nearby villages gradually connected distant places, not through intention, but through necessity. Traders followed seasonal routes, pilgrims traced ancient lines of devotion, and messengers moved between courts carrying sealed words that were never meant to linger. Along these routes, something else traveled as well, quietly and without form: names. At first, the movement of names felt accidental. A traveler might pause in a foreign village and mention a lord whose hospitality had been generous, or a knight whose presence on the road had offered safety. These mentions were not announcements. They were fragments, woven into other stories, softened by distance. Yet even in their fragility, they carried weight. To hear a name spoken in a place where its owner had never stood created a subtle shift in how the world was perceived. In this emerging network of roads and resting places, reputation began to detach from location. A name could arrive before the person did, carried by memory rather than footsteps. This was unfamiliar territory. Until then, recognition required presence. Now, recognition could precede it. For knights, whose lives often unfolded between duty and travel, this shift was especially significant. A knight riding into an unfamiliar town might notice a pause in the air, a slight change in attention, based not on armor or bearing, but on whether the name attached to that armor had already arrived. Sometimes it had, sometimes it had not. Either way, the uncertainty itself was new. Names traveled unevenly. Some were carried far by chance encounters. Others remained bound to their place of origin. The reasons were rarely logical. A single act, witnessed by the right person, could ripple outward, while years of steady service might remain unspoken beyond familiar walls. In this way, reputation began to resemble something organic, growing where conditions allowed, fading where they did not. Monasteries played a quiet role in this transformation. As centers of record and reflection, they gathered fragments of the world and preserved them in careful script. While most lives passed unnoticed, some names found their way into margins, chronicles, or lists of benefactors. Once written, a name gained a different kind of endurance. It no longer depended solely on memory. It could be encountered by eyes far removed from the moment that gave rise to it. Yet even written names were incomplete. They lacked the warmth of presence, the nuance of character. A name on parchment was a shadow, suggesting shape without revealing substance. Still, shadows have power. They invite imagination. And imagination, once engaged, begins to move on its own. As evening settled over roadside inns and shared halls, travelers exchanged fragments of their journeys. Fires burned low, and the world outside receded into darkness. In these moments, stories surfaced naturally, not as performances, but as a way to pass time. A knight mentioned here, a lord recalled there. Details blurred, emphasis shifted. What remained was not accuracy, but impression. Over time, certain impressions repeated themselves. A name associated with fairness, another with severity, another with generosity. These associations hardened slowly, shaped by repetition rather than truth. The person behind the name might never know how they were being imagined elsewhere. Influence, in its earliest form, was already becoming asymmetrical. This distance between action and perception introduced a quiet tension. Knights continued to act according to their immediate surroundings, unaware that those actions might echo far beyond. A decision made in one valley could influence expectations in another. The self was no longer contained entirely within the present moment. Still, this was not yet a world of performance. No one acted for unseen audiences. The idea itself would have felt strange, unnecessary. Actions were still rooted in duty, loyalty, and survival. But beneath the surface, the conditions for something new were forming. Names, once bound to faces, now floated freely. They passed from mouth to mouth, changing shape, gathering meaning that did not always belong to them. And as they traveled, they created a new kind of presence, one that existed without body or voice. In the quiet of the night, this shift feels gentle, almost comforting. The world is expanding, not through noise, but through connection. Roads continue into darkness, carrying stories that will be retold, reshaped, and remembered differently each time. And somewhere along these roads, symbols begin to matter more than ever. Because when a name arrives first, the mind seeks something to attach it to. As names began to travel, something else quietly emerged alongside them: symbols. In a world without screens or printed news, where memory and storytelling carried the weight of history, visual markers became the earliest form of identity that could be recognized from afar. Shields, banners, and crests were no longer merely protective or decorative. They became the first profiles, silently signaling presence, reputation, and alignment. The practice of heraldry, still young and evolving, offered a language of color, shape, and pattern. Each symbol carried meaning, understood by those who knew to read it, and interpreted by those who did not. A knight's shield might bear a lion for courage, a tree for steadfastness, or a simple stripe for lineage. To see such symbols from a distance was to glimpse a story, to understand someone's place in the broader tapestry of life without ever hearing their name. In villages and along roads, travelers and residents alike began noticing these subtle cues. The eye, trained to recognize danger and opportunity, learned to read intention, character, and even aspiration. Unlike spoken names, which drifted and transformed with each retelling, symbols were immediate, tangible, and, in some sense, unyielding. They were statements made without sound, reminders that presence itself could communicate. Knights themselves grew aware of the power of these markers. Choosing symbols was no longer only about lineage. It was about perception. The exact shade of blue, the curve of a design, the placement on a shield or surcoat, all mattered. Each choice could subtly influence how one was remembered in places far beyond their own experience. A well-recognized symbol became a vessel for a name, carrying its echoes across towns and valleys. Markets, inns, and fairs became theaters for these silent conversations. A distant banner above a gate drew attention before a knight arrived. Conversations paused, eyes shifted, and subtle recognition rippled through the crowd. People began associating acts with symbols. A gesture of courtesy under a specific emblem might create a lasting impression, forming connections that transcended immediate encounters. In this way, the symbol and the individual began to merge, forming the foundation of reputation beyond presence. Even within castles and fortified halls, the walls bore testimony to these emerging profiles. Tapestries, painted shields, and carved crests adorned spaces not simply to display beauty, but to communicate quietly. They told who belonged, who had acted nobly, who had endured trials with dignity. Visitors could read a room as they might a storybook, the symbols offering insight into character and history. In some cases, a symbol might outlive the deeds themselves, remembered long after the knight had departed or passed. Over time, symbols acquired layers of meaning beyond what their originators intended. A lion might signify courage in one region, leadership in another. A simple cross could represent faith, duty, or heritage. Interpretation became a dance of imagination and memory, connecting observer and observed across distance and time. The traveler who glimpsed a familiar pattern felt a small, silent recognition, an early echo of what would one day be called social influence. The act of creating and choosing symbols also introduced reflection. Knights considered how they wished to be seen, how their actions might be interpreted, and how these silent markers might carry their reputation forward. This was the first gentle tension between who they were and who they appeared to be, a subtle prelude to influence beyond immediate perception. It was not performance in the modern sense, but awareness of an audience that existed not as faces in front of them, but as imagination and memory reaching outward. Even the smallest settlements felt the effects of this visual communication. A painted sign or emblem on a merchant's stall might attract recognition, or a family crest above a doorway might quietly convey standing and trustworthiness. Symbols, in their silent grace, allowed stories to travel faster, giving shape to names before those names were heard aloud. And yet, in all of this, the world remained gentle, measured, unhurried. A knight could walk beneath his emblem without knowing how it would be read miles away. The observer could glimpse the meaning without interrupting the peace of the day. In this subtle exchange, the quiet pulse of influence began to emerge, carrying with it the seeds of recognition that did not depend on presence, sound, or speed. The world continued to breathe in its steady rhythm, while these small visual currents moved silently through it. Symbols had become the first profiles, anchors for identity in a world just beginning to sense the reach of reputation. And as night fell, these markers, glowing softly in torchlight or moonlight, whispered their stories to anyone patient enough to notice, laying the groundwork for the unfolding chapters of history yet to come. With symbols now carrying meaning across distance, the world of knights began to embrace another form of quiet visibility, the tournament. These gatherings, held in open fields beyond castle walls, were not merely tests of skill or displays of martial prowess. They were the earliest public arenas in which reputation could be seen and measured beyond one's immediate surroundings. Here, the actions of individuals became stories, told in movement, gesture, and emblem, and observed by those whose gaze might extend far beyond the moment. Before the tournament began, the fields lay still under morning light. Dew clung to the grass, and the soft murmur of distant streams accompanied the gentle creaking of leather and armor. Knights arrived quietly, their banners snapping faintly in the breeze, each emblem a silent statement of identity. Those symbols, once small and private, were now elevated for all to notice. Onlookers, from villagers to visiting nobility, learned to read these visual cues with careful attention, each recognizing the subtle differences that set one knight apart from another. The tournament was structured yet unhurried. Justs and melees unfolded in slow progression, each engagement an opportunity for a name and its symbol to resonate through the crowd. A successful pass of a lance, a graceful maneuver on horseback, a display of controlled strength. All were observed, remembered, and shared long after the moment had passed. The audience became a silent network, transmitting impressions from one group to another, not by words alone, but by glances, gestures, and the repeated recognition of symbols. In these public gatherings, influence began to take on a tangible form. A knight who had earned a reputation for precision might see a ripple of recognition spread as he entered the field. Eyes followed him, not only in admiration, but in anticipation of the story that would unfold. Each act became a node in an invisible web, linking deeds to perception. The tournament, in essence, functioned as an analog social network, a place where presence, performance, and identity intersected. Beyond the field, the impact of these displays reached into surrounding villages. Merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers would recount the events with reverent detail, adding their own flourishes to the narrative. A single display of skill could elevate a name across counties, carried by those who had witnessed it, long before letters or chronicles recorded it. Through repetition and retelling, the knight's symbol began to embody more than lineage. It became shorthand for narrative, expectation, and influence. The pace of observation was deliberate. Unlike the rush of modern attention, the focus of those present lingered, absorbing each movement, allowing subtlety and nuance to settle. A misstep, while noticed, did not ruin perception entirely. Observers understood the rhythms of practice and fatigue. The long duration of tournaments permitted patterns to emerge. Competence and character could be inferred, and these inferences slowly shaped reputations that would travel farther than any one spectator. Within the castle walls that hosted these events, the anticipation was mirrored in quiet preparation. Squires adjusted armor straps, polished weapons, and ensured that every emblem was displayed with care. The knights themselves moved through the day with a rhythm that balanced readiness with reflection. Their actions were deliberate, but not performative in the modern sense. They moved for duty, for honor, for the quiet understanding that their deeds would echo beyond the immediate. Even the spectators contributed to the flow of influence. Elders nodded in approval, children whispered observations to one another, and traders shared tales in the marketplace long after the joust concluded. These layers of attention intertwined to form a slowly spreading consciousness of accomplishment. The tournament, therefore, became more than spectacle. It was a medium through which reputation circulated, reinforced, and occasionally transformed. As shadows lengthened and evening approached, the field quieted. Horses were led back to stables, banners lowered, and spectators began the slow walk home. Yet the impact lingered. Stories would be recounted by firelight in distant villages, symbols would be sketched in the margins of manuscripts, and names associated with visible skill would gain a life of their own. The acts themselves were ephemeral, but the impressions they left were lasting, setting the stage for a world in which presence and performance carried weight beyond physical proximity. In these tournaments, the interplay between action and observation laid the foundation for what we might now recognize as social awareness. Recognition was not instant, nor universally distributed. It was gentle, layered, and cumulative. And yet, as one knight departed the field beneath a glowing sunset, his emblem catching the last light of day, it was clear that the seeds of a wider, subtler network of influence were already growing. The evening air carried whispers of accomplishment and potential, of lessons learned and reputation cemented. The field that had been so still in the morning now rested in memory and story. And as night approached, the quiet anticipation of the next gathering, the next interaction, hung softly in the air, an unspoken promise that the journey of reputation and influence was only beginning. In the quiet aftermath of tournaments, when banners had been lowered and the dust of the field settled, certain names began to resonate more strongly than others. A few knights, through a combination of skill, demeanor, and the subtle alignment of symbol and story, became quietly remembered, not for grand gestures alone, but for consistency, presence, and the gentle weight of reputation that lingered long after their actions had ceased. These were the first figures whose influence began to extend beyond immediate perception, whose names traveled with more purpose, carried silently by observers and chroniclers alike. The remembered knight was not necessarily the most extraordinary in a single act. Rather, he was marked by the accumulation of small, deliberate deeds that, when observed together, formed an impression of trustworthiness, courage, and quiet mastery. Each act, whether a measured maneuver in the tournament or a careful response to the needs of the village, contributed to a slowly expanding legacy. The repetition of these behaviors allowed observers to recognize a pattern, even if they had only glimpsed fragments of it. This pattern became the first gentle pulse of what might one day be called social influence. In distant inns and marketplaces, names attached to symbols began to echo, as travelers and merchants shared tales of knights whose presence was quietly profound. A shield glimpsed from a hilltop, a courteous gesture toward a messenger, or a single decisive act in a field skirmish could become a story carried far beyond the event itself. Each retelling added subtle layers, the names slowly gathering resonance and recognition, like a bell whose tone lingers in a quiet valley long after it has been struck. The process was gradual. Not every knight who sought to be remembered succeeded. Some faded from notice, their deeds unremarked, swallowed by the routine of daily life. Others, by virtue of circumstance or attentiveness, left impressions that traveled farther and longer. The remembered knight emerged almost by accident, a combination of deliberate presence and the gentle currents of perception flowing around him. In this way, reputation became its own living force, distinct from the individual, yet inseparably connected to the traces they left behind. Within the halls of castles and the chambers of local lords, scribes began to record the echoes of these reputations. Chronicles noted who had excelled, who had maintained composure under pressure, who had quietly ensured the welfare of others. Though these written accounts were sparse and uneven, they provided a tether, allowing the knight's name to persist beyond immediate memory. Each notation added permanence, anchoring the ephemeral flow of attention into something more enduring. Symbols alone were no longer sufficient. Deeds, carefully observed and repeated, gave them context and depth. Yet even as a knight became remembered, the recognition was subtle and layered, never overwhelming the calm rhythms of life. Observers did not rush to announce or broadcast. Rather, they internalized, absorbed, and gently shared impressions when appropriate. This slow transmission of influence created a lattice of awareness across villages, towns, and regions, allowing certain names to surface repeatedly, quietly growing in significance. The remembered knight existed not in a spotlight, but in a soft network of attention, extending through memory, symbol, and story. Even within the knight's own perception, the rise of reputation was a delicate matter. Awareness of being remembered did not compel flamboyance. In fact, many continued to act as they had always acted, guided by duty, honor, and the quiet standards of their society. Their symbols and names moved ahead of them almost without their intervention, carried by the currents of observation that they had barely noticed. This was an early, unspoken tension between self and image, action and perception, a gentle precursor to the complexities of influence that would emerge centuries later. Travelers, too, contributed to this phenomenon. The merchant who recounted the knight's acts, the pilgrim who noticed his emblem, or the villager who spoke of his measured conduct all participated in the expansion of reputation. Each observer, acting as both witness and messenger, helped a name take root in the consciousness of places far from the knight's immediate presence. In this way, influence became cumulative, subtle, and enduring, much like the slow shaping of stone by flowing water. As evening descended and shadows lengthened over quiet roads and village squares, the remembered knight's presence was felt not only in the places he had directly touched, but in the spaces between, in the imagination and memory of those who carried fragments of his story. It was an invisible network, built on perception, attention, and repeated observation. The quiet resonance of his name served as a connective thread, linking distant observers and communities in the gentle acknowledgement of deeds performed with care and purpose. Over time, the concept of being remembered became inseparable from the symbols he bore and the small, consistent acts he performed. Each emblem, each shield, each gesture contributed to a tapestry of influence that moved quietly through space and time. The knight's reputation was no longer confined to the immediate moment or location. It floated outward, subtle yet persistent, touching those who would carry the story forward, often without ever encountering the knight directly. In the hush of the night, when all is still and the world is held in soft shadow, the rise of the remembered knight feels natural and unhurried. There is no clamor, no urgency, only the steady unfolding of recognition, the gentle growth of presence across distance and memory. And as the day gives way to darkness, the quiet patterns of reputation continue to ripple outward, laying the foundation for influence that is felt rather than shouted, observed rather than displayed, and remembered rather than proclaimed. As names and symbols moved across roads, fields, and villages, a subtler, quieter force began to take shape. The murmurs of rumor and the slow formation of silent followers. In the world before written news and instant communication, these whispered currents carried stories, shaped perception, and expanded the reach of the remembered knight far beyond the places he had visited. The mechanisms were gentle, almost imperceptible, but their effects were enduring, weaving connections between communities that had never directly interacted. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims became unwitting broadcasters of reputation. A knight's emblem seen from a distance, a courteous act observed at an inn, or a decisive gesture on the battlefield provided material for stories that spread in hushed tones. Villagers spoke quietly of what they had witnessed, often framing the tale in ways that reflected their own perspectives. Over time, these retellings layered upon one another, creating a tapestry of impressions that extended influence without overt performance. Silent followers emerged from these currents. They were not public champions or heralds, but individuals who, through observation and reflection, adopted the knight as a model. A squire might notice the careful alignment of armor and shield and carry that practice forward. A merchant might recall the knight's measured interactions and imitate the discretion he observed. These followers often remained unseen, their presence inferred only through small acts of quiet emulation, but they were the first nodes of influence beyond immediate observation. Rumors, too, were integral. They were shaped not by intention, but by the natural tendency of humans to interpret, embellish, and remember. A minor act of bravery could be recast as a defining moment. A single demonstration of generosity might be told as evidence of enduring character. While accuracy varied, the underlying narrative gained coherence through repetition, and the knight's name became associated with qualities that transcended any one act. These whispers traveled with remarkable subtlety, reaching distant villages and courts, extending the reach of his reputation like a shadow, following him across the land. The formation of silent followers created a feedback loop. Observers who had heard of the knight's deeds were more likely to notice him when he appeared, amplifying the effects of small gestures. A courteous bow, a deliberate movement in a tournament, or a subtle signal of skill resonated more strongly when the audience carried expectations in advance. In this way, perception began to shape reality, not through force, but through awareness, forming the earliest strands of influence networks that relied on observation, memory, and reflection. Within castle halls and along dusty roads, whispers intertwined with ritual and routine. Scribes noted names and chronicles. Neighbors exchanged stories over evening fires, and children repeated fragments of tales with awe or curiosity. Each retelling reinforced patterns of attention, slowly embedding certain qualities into communal memory. The knight's name became not merely an identifier, but a symbol of particular virtues, recognized even by those who had never encountered him directly. This silent following was subtle but transformative. Unlike modern fame, it did not demand recognition. It existed quietly, accumulating momentum over time. The knight himself might remain unaware of the growing network of observers, yet his actions had consequences far beyond immediate perception. Influence, in this form, required patience, observation, and the cumulative weight of repeated gestures. It was not broadcast, it was absorbed, internalized, and gently reflected in the actions of others. Even the environment played a role. Inns, market squares, and churchyards became nodes where rumors and observation converged. Travelers would pause to exchange impressions. Villagers would discuss nuances of conduct, and patterns emerged across time and space. Each whisper, each quiet acknowledgement of skill or virtue, extended the reach of the remembered knight, reinforcing the perception that he was both present and enduring even where he was not. Over the course of years, this network of whispers and silent followers allowed reputation to solidify into something more enduring. A single name could bridge valleys, cross rivers, and connect communities separated by days of travel. The remembered knight, once local in recognition, now carried a presence that was felt in multiple locations simultaneously through the delicate channels of memory and narrative. Influence had become decentralized, not enforced by authority, but woven organically into the fabric of everyday life. As evening descended and night deepened, the quiet streets and countryside seemed to pulse with these unseen currents. Fires flickered behind windows, lanterns glowed along paths, and the gentle rhythm of life carried whispers into homes, stables, and halls. The knight's name persisted in these quiet spaces, softly remembered, silently acknowledged, and subtly emulated. It was a presence without noise, a network without formal structure, yet profoundly effective in shaping the perception and behavior of those who encountered it, directly or indirectly. This pattern of whispered stories and silent following established a critical foundation for what would eventually become the more structured forms of social influence and reputation. It demonstrated that even in a slow, unhurried world, identity could travel beyond immediate surroundings, that observation could transmit meaning, and that influence could be felt long before it was consciously recognized. In this gentle unfolding, the medieval landscape itself became an echo chamber for deeds and names, a place where reputation was cultivated with patience, subtlety, and care. As the knight, deepened and the world softened into darkness, the quiet network of attention persisted. Whispers traveled through corridors, alleys, and roads, reaching those who would carry them further. Silent followers adopted practices, symbols, and behaviors, expanding influence beyond visibility. And in these soft currents, the remembered knight lived not only in the deeds performed, but in the enduring impressions they left, connecting distant places, generations, and imaginations through the quiet power of observation. By the time whispers and silent followers had begun to settle across villages and towns, the notion of influence was no longer a solitary phenomenon. Quietly, imperceptibly, an early network had formed. It was woven from names, symbols, observed actions, and repeated stories. Though no one would have recognized it as a network at the time, its structure resembled the intricate web of attention and awareness that centuries later would define social systems. In the medieval world, this network moved slowly, deliberately, and gently, yet its impact was profound. Knights and travelers became the first connectors. A squire accompanying his lord might carry tales of battles and gestures from town to town, extending the reach of the knight's reputation without fanfare. Merchants, following the circuit of markets and fairs, unwittingly reinforced these patterns, retelling stories that shaped perception far from the original events. Pilgrims, whose routes crossed multiple regions, added their own observations, sometimes embellishing, sometimes clarifying. Through these overlapping paths, a name, a symbol, and the story behind it began to ripple outward like soft waves in still water. The early network operated on subtle principles. Attention was selective, shaped by proximity, timing, and the observer's own experiences. Not every tale traveled far. Not every act was noticed. Yet the cumulative effect was remarkable. Slowly, knights whose actions had been carefully observed and whose symbols had been clearly communicated began to occupy a place in the shared awareness of multiple communities. This awareness was fragmented, uneven, and often imperfect, but it persisted, extending the influence of a single individual well beyond immediate sight. Within castles, courts, and monasteries, this emerging network became visible in quiet ways. Chronicles recorded deeds, names were remembered in prayers, and heralds carried messages that reinforced recognition. Even in private conversations, patterns of admiration, caution, and respect propagated. Observers internalized the qualities associated with a knight: courage, fairness, skill, and reflected them in subsequent interactions, subtly guiding expectations and shaping responses. Influence, in this sense, was as much about perception as about action. The mechanics of the network were naturally emergent. No central authority orchestrated its formation. Rather, it developed organically through repeated observation, retelling, and attention. The more a knight's deeds were witnessed or spoken of, the more likely they were to be remembered in new locations. Each node, be it a village elder, a traveling merchant, or a scribe, acted as a conduit, passing impressions along in a manner both delicate and enduring. These conduits were interconnected by shared knowledge and expectation, creating a lattice of awareness that could extend for miles and endure across seasons. Travelers who were part of the network learned, often unconsciously, to anticipate and recognize symbols and actions associated with notable figures. A particular emblem on a shield or banner would spark recognition, subtly connecting memory with expectation. Observers, whether they had witnessed the deeds themselves or only heard of them secondhand, began to notice patterns, and these patterns formed the backbone of influence. The knight's presence became a node of attention, even when he was physically absent. This early network also fostered a degree of standardization in perception. Certain behaviors, gestures, and displays of skill became signals that could be universally interpreted across regions. A measured bow, a precise maneuver in the tournament, or the careful placement of an emblem on a surcoat transmitted meaning consistently. Through repeated observation, these signals gained reliability, allowing the network to function as a medium of recognition and influence. In this way, knights could extend their reach and reputation without direct interaction with every observer. Even subtle acts, unnoticed in isolation, gained significance through network amplification. A courteous gesture toward a messenger might be recounted multiple times, each retelling layering interpretation and expectation. Over weeks and months, these amplified acts contributed to the knight's remembered character, shaping both immediate perception and distant recognition. Influence became cumulative, subtle, and enduring, a property of the network itself rather than any single performance. The quiet strength of these early networks lay in their resilience and adaptability. Observers could filter, embellish, and interpret information, yet the patterns of recognition persisted. A knight's symbol, once encoded with meaning, traveled through the lattice of attention, connecting distant observers and communities. Each repetition reinforced awareness, creating a slowly expanding sphere of influence that existed alongside daily life, unnoticed yet potent. In this way, medieval society cultivated the first structures of social perception, long before written analysis or intentional design. By evening, as moonlight softened the edges of villages, castles, and countryside, the network hummed in silence. Names, symbols, and impressions circulated, binding communities together in shared understanding. The remembered knight, whose deeds had been observed, retold, and reflected, became more than a figure of immediate presence. He became a thread in the fabric of a social web, extending through space, time, and memory. And though the world remained calm, unhurried, and largely unaware of the mechanisms at play, the early influence of networks was quietly shaping perception, expectation, and the enduring power of reputation. As networks of observation, whispers, and silent followers grew, a new dimension of reputation emerged: the challenge. Knights found that influence, though subtle and cumulative, was fragile and required reinforcement through contests and displays of skill. Reputation was no longer merely remembered. It could be tested, compared, and reshaped through deliberate acts that demonstrated competence, courage, and consistency in the eyes of others. These contests took many forms, often quietly integrated into daily life, rather than confined to formal tournaments. A duel between two knights on the outskirts of a village, a careful demonstration of martial skill before visiting nobility, or even a measured decision in resolving disputes could all become arenas in which reputation was contested. While the world remained calm and unhurried, these acts carried weight for observers, silent and attentive, recorded each gesture, each move, each subtle signal, and transmitted its significance through their networks of attention. In the early hours of the morning, before the sun warmed the stone courtyards, knights prepared quietly for the day's challenges. Squires adjusted armor, polished swords, and ensured that banners and symbols were perfectly aligned. These preparations, though mundane in appearance, were crucial for establishing the impression of readiness and meticulousness. The audience of observers, villagers, merchants, travelers, often arrived unannounced, their presence known only through distant movement or the occasional flicker of light. Every act was subject to scrutiny, not through overt measurement, but through quiet, sustained attention. The outcomes of these contests were rarely shouted or celebrated in the way one might imagine in later histories. Instead, subtle signs of performance carried meaning. A perfectly executed maneuver on horseback, a disciplined formation in a minor skirmish, or the careful resolution of a dispute conveyed competence and authority. Observers internalized these signals, creating a shared understanding of the knight's skill and character. Reputation, in this sense, was not merely observed. It was interpreted, absorbed, and slowly propagated through networks of memory and attention. Challenges were also a means of reinforcing patterns established by symbols and prior deeds. A knight whose emblem had already become recognized in surrounding towns found that consistent performance in contests amplified the resonance of his reputation. Conversely, a lapse in conduct could diminish the effect of prior achievements, subtly altering the perception held by silent followers. Reputation required not only skill, but continuity, a delicate balance maintained over time, woven into daily interactions, tournaments, and minor trials alike. Within castle walls, the significance of these contests extended beyond personal reputation. Lords and patrons observed carefully, noting patterns of behavior that could influence assignments, alliances, and responsibilities. A knight who consistently demonstrated courage, prudence, and discipline became a quiet authority, a figure whose presence commanded respect without the need for overt proclamation. The web of influence extended, linking direct observation, chroniclers' notes, and the careful interpretation of those who had witnessed both symbols and deeds. Reputation, it seemed, was both personal and communal, sustained by action and reflection alike. The subtlety of contests ensured that influence remained deliberate and enduring. Unlike modern spectacles designed to capture immediate attention, these challenges unfolded slowly, allowing patterns to emerge and recognition to deepen. Observers could witness repeated acts, compare behaviors across contexts, and form nuanced judgments about character and skill. In this way, the network of attention was not merely a passive conduit. It became an active mechanism for reinforcing, amplifying, and sometimes challenging perception. Even the quiet villages beyond the castle walls played a role in this system. Market squares, inns, and common spaces became stages for indirect observation. Travelers passing through might note the disciplined movement of a knight or the careful alignment of banners. Merchants and villagers would recount these details to others, adding context and subtle interpretation. The ripple effect extended the influence of the knight beyond immediate visibility, creating a lattice of recognition that connected multiple observers across time and space. The beauty of this system lay in its unhurried nature. Influence and reputation did not require performance for its own sake. They were the product of cumulative attention, repeated deeds, and the quiet reflection of those who observed. A single contest might be brief, but its echoes traveled through networks of memory, shaping perception far from the field, hall, or courtyard where it had occurred. Reputation, once built through symbols, tournaments, and whispered stories, found its true strength in these challenges and contests, where action met observation in a delicate, sustained equilibrium. As evening approached and shadows stretched across stone walls and grassy fields, the results of the day's challenges settled into memory and story. Silent followers internalized what they had seen. Travelers carried impressions to distant villages, and chroniclers recorded fragments that would later anchor tales for future generations. The knight's name and emblem, reinforced through repeated action, resonated in ways both subtle and enduring, a quiet testament to the power of consistent, deliberate conduct. And so, in the calm unfolding of each day, contests of reputation shaped the early networks of influence, demonstrating that recognition was earned not through a single gesture, but through the careful, repeated, and thoughtful engagement with the world. Reputation became both a mirror and a thread, reflecting character while connecting observers across space and time, quietly preparing the medieval world for the complex structures of influence and social perception that would one day emerge more fully. As time passed, the quiet patterns of observation, whispered stories, and contests of skill began to resonate beyond the immediate surroundings of a knight's travels. What had once been local recognition expanded into a broader, regional awareness. Names and symbols, once confined to a single village or castle, now echoed across valleys, rivers, and distant towns. These echoes of reputation traveled slowly, carried by merchants, pilgrims, travelers, and scribes, intertwining multiple communities in shared recognition of skill, honor, and measured conduct. A knight's influence, once reliant on direct observation, now depended increasingly on the accuracy and persistence of memory. Travelers would recount tales they had heard in one town to listeners in another, carefully preserving the essence of actions, while occasionally interpreting minor details to fit local understanding. Over time, the repetition of these stories lent them an almost ritual quality. They were no longer mere anecdotes. They became threads weaving the fabric of reputation across regions, subtle yet enduring. In the quiet countryside, at the edge of forests and along meandering roads, traders and messengers played a vital role. A single well-timed remark about a knight's honorable conduct, or a description of his emblem seen from a distance, could travel miles and shape perception in villages and castles that had never directly observed the individual. These echoes were not uniform. They varied in detail, emphasis, and interpretation, but the underlying impression remained. A figure of consistent skill and quiet influence had moved through the land, leaving traces that were slowly integrated into collective awareness. The network of silent followers expanded in tandem. Those who had once observed the Knight personally now found themselves joined by others who knew him only through stories. They internalized the patterns of behavior conveyed through repeated accounts, adopting gestures, routines, or symbols as a way of aligning with the perceived ideals of honor and skill. These new followers extended influence across regions without direct contact, reinforcing the original actions and amplifying the echoes of reputation. A name became more than a label. It became a symbol of conduct, a subtle template for emulation. Even in remote monasteries, where scribes recorded events for posterity, the echoes of reputation persisted. Chronicles noted appearances, minor victories, and gestures of discretion or fairness. Over decades, these written accounts complemented oral transmission, creating a dual pathway for recognition. Observers far from the original sites could access these records, connecting isolated perceptions into a larger mosaic of understanding. Reputation, once immediate and local, became layered, extending both through memory and text across regions and generations. The subtle spread of influence also shaped expectations. When a knight entered a new region, observers anticipated behavior based on prior echoes. A courteous bow, careful alignment of armor, or strategic maneuver carried amplified significance because it resonated with previously transmitted stories. The knight's actions now interacted with a landscape of expectation, reinforcing or subtly adjusting impressions depending on performance. Influence had become dynamic, responsive, and cumulative, extending its reach across space and context. The countryside itself seemed to absorb these echoes. Market squares, roads, and castle courtyards became nodes where stories, observation, and symbols intersected. Travelers, merchants, and villagers each acted as conduits, interpreting and retelling what they had seen or heard. The rhythm of life, quiet, unhurried, and reflective, allowed these narratives to be received, remembered, and gently transmitted. The echo of reputation was not loud or overt. It was a soft, pervasive presence, gradually shaping perceptions across an expanding region. Even as recognition spread, the original acts remained central. Observers who had personally witnessed the knight's conduct could anchor stories in memory, providing subtle verification for those encountering the echoes for the first time. This interplay of direct observation and transmitted story created a layered network of influence, reinforcing consistency while allowing flexibility in interpretation. Reputation, in this sense, became both stable and adaptive, a living phenomenon sustained by attention, memory, and reflection. The enduring power of these echoes lay in their quiet persistence. Names and deeds repeated, interpreted, and transmitted created a sense of presence that transcended physical proximity. A knight might be absent for weeks or months, yet his influence lingered, subtly guiding behavior, shaping expectations, and inspiring silent emulation across regions. What had begun as local recognition had grown into a broad, interconnected awareness, a soft network of attention that anticipated the complex systems of social influence yet to come. As dusk fell and shadows stretched over villages, forests, and castle walls, the echoes of reputation moved quietly through the land. Stories and impressions traveled with travelers on roads dimly lit by lanterns and moonlight. Names whispered by merchants in marketplaces, recounted by pilgrims along pilgrimage routes, or noted by scribes in distant monasteries wove an invisible web, connecting people, places, and memories. The knight's presence, though physically limited, was now felt across vast distances, a calm and enduring force shaped by the gentle currents of observation and remembrance. In this slow unfolding, influence became a landscape itself. Regions were subtly stitched together by echoes of reputation, the movements of silent followers, and the careful attention of observers. Deeds, symbols, and stories accumulated, layering meaning upon memory, extending recognition far beyond immediate experience. And in the stillness of night, as the world settled into quiet reflection, these echoes persisted, carrying the legacy of a single figure across space and time, soft, gentle, and profoundly enduring. As the years unfolded and seasons passed across the medieval landscape, the subtle webs of observation, contests, and echoed reputation coalesced into a quiet legacy. The knight's presence, once immediate and tangible, had transformed into a sustained influence that persisted even as the world changed around him. The actions of a single figure, observed, remembered, and retold across regions, had seeded an enduring pattern. The power of influence not through force or proclamation, but through gentle consistency, thoughtful action, and the patient movement of attention across networks of human experience. The legacy was not written in grand monuments or lavish chronicles alone, though traces of it appeared in the stonework of castles, the notes of scribes, and the careful alignment of banners. Its true endurance lay in the collective memory of communities, travelers, merchants, and silent followers. These were people who had observed, remembered, and internalized patterns of conduct, carrying them forward in small acts of imitation, reflection, and subtle reinforcement. A courteous bow, a carefully executed maneuver, a disciplined approach to negotiation. These gestures were preserved, repeated, and amplified, extending influence far beyond the original moment of action. Across valleys, villages, and castle roads, stories continued to ripple outward. Traders passing through unfamiliar towns spoke in hushed tones of acts they had witnessed or heard about, adding their own reflections and interpretations. Pilgrims carried tales of honor and prudence along winding routes to distant monasteries. Even in remote hamlets, the echoes of deeds observed long ago informed expectations, shaping behavior, decorum, and subtle social norms. The knight, though possibly absent for years, lived on in the quiet attentions of those who remembered. These patterns of enduring influence reveal a principle fundamental to human society, that the quiet consistency of action, observed and transmitted, can outlast immediacy and spectacle. Whereas brief, dramatic gestures might capture attention momentarily, the slow, deliberate unfolding of skill, kindness, and fairness imprints itself in memory and collective perception. Through repeated observation and reflection, networks of influence expand and endure, connecting people across time and geography in ways both subtle and profound. Monasteries, market squares, and castle halls became repositories of memory, nodes in a distributed network of recognition. Chronicles recorded key moments, but more importantly, they preserved the rhythm and context of deeds. Merchants' recollections, travelers' tales, and villagers' quiet reflections complemented these records, providing a living, breathing archive of influence. In this way, the knight's legacy transcended his immediate actions, creating a pattern of social memory that was as durable as it was gentle. Even as generations passed, the subtle networks of influence remained. Young squires learned not only the technical skills of swordplay and horsemanship, but also the behavioral patterns and symbols observed in the actions of esteemed figures. Children grew up hearing stories that shaped expectations of conduct, fairness, and courage. These cultural echoes were the true vessels of legacy, not monuments or fleeting fame, but patterns of behavior carried forward, replicated and adapted by successive generations, extending influence quietly but persistently across time. The landscape itself seemed to participate in this enduring pattern. Stone roads, rivers, and market pathways trace the movement of stories, emblems, and subtle gestures of skill. Shadows lengthened over castles, village squares, and woodland trails, carrying silent witness to repeated acts of recognition and attention. Each gesture, each observation, each retold story contributed to a vast, slow-moving tapestry, interweaving communities and regions through a shared understanding of character, skill, and honor. In the evening hush, as fires flickered in windows and moonlight softened the edges of hills and forests, the quiet endurance of influence became almost palpable. Observers, silent and attentive, reflected on past encounters and stories, integrating their memory into everyday life. Travelers repeated tales for distant listeners, merchants recounted patterns to customers, and scribes preserved fragments of recognition for posterity. Through these intertwined acts, the legacy of the Knight persisted, not as a transient name or fleeting fame, but as a living, enduring network of subtle recognition and repeated emulation. This quiet endurance demonstrates that influence is not always immediate or forceful. It does not require proclamation or spectacle. Instead, it thrives through patience, observation, reflection, and the careful propagation of deeds across space and time. The medieval knight, once a figure of local recognition, became a node in a broader, distributed network of perception and memory. His actions, amplified through whispers, observation, contests, and echoes across regions, persisted in subtle but profound ways, shaping the understanding and behavior of countless individuals across generations. As the night deepened and the world settled into calm, a final sense of continuity emerged. The knight's legacy, though invisible to many, endured through quiet repetition, sustained memory, and the subtle networks of attention established over years of careful conduct. Influence, it seemed, was not bound to the immediate or the spectacular, but to the deliberate, the observed, and the remembered. And in this quiet endurance, the essence of legacy revealed itself, a soft, pervasive, and enduring presence that carried forward the principles of observation, reflection, and subtle connection, linking communities, regions, and generations through the gentle power of reputation. You don't need to keep listening anymore. The story can fade into the background now, becoming softer with every moment. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. There's no rush and nothing you need to remember. Just let your breathing slow down, let your thoughts drift where they want to go, and allow the quiet of this night to settle around you. This story will remain here, gently playing while you rest. Tomorrow night, a new night will be waiting for you, and it's one you won't want to miss. And if sleep hasn't arrived just yet, you can quietly return to one of the previous nights and let those stories guide you instead. For now, sleep well.